Let's get to it. What's up? Welcome to the Fantasy Football Garage. I'm Chris the Candyman. Follow me on Twitter at FFB Garage. It's a late night stream. And thanks for watching. And make sure you subscribe, and follow me on Twitter. Today's agenda. I'm going to be sharing with you my rookie running back research. I've put together some college production profiles over the last couple weeks, doing some late night fantasy football research, and I wanted to share it with you. I thought it'd be fun, and actually put it together in a game that we'll get to later. But first, recent news I want to talk about. Best Ball Mania 4, insane, huge $15 million in total prizes up for grabs. $3 million to first place. It's going to be a lot of fun. There's going to be a lot of great content coming out this summer for Best Ball Mania, for Best Ball in general. So really excited about that. Awesome stuff. Also, obviously, this Thursday there's a little draft going on, so I won't talk too much more about that. I am pretty excited about that. I'm actually going to Tampa Bay for the NFL draft. I'm going to meet up with some of the boys and see what we can get into. I actually got my official Texans draft hat. You know, the Texans had the second overall pick. Pretty excited. Thought it was time to up my hat game. Have a hat from the playoffs from a decade ago, and so the official, you can see it, the official Texans draft cap. Very nice. And I'm guessing it's going to be Will Levis wearing this, or Will Anderson. We'll see. I mean, I'm pretty undecided how I feel about it. But we'll be celebrating in Tampa. We'll be in Tampa Bay over the weekend for the draft, hanging out, hitting up the beach, and should be a good time. Also, with Underdog, we just wrapped up the first Superflex big board tournament, this season. I actually just had to slow draft 2 of them in today. I did a total of 12 entries, most of them actually slow drafts with my current schedule and kind of intermittent availability to stick to a consistent hour without having responsibility with the baby at home. And so fast drafts are kind of a thing of the past for right now, but I think I'm finding a way to work it in. Actually, I'm going to work it into my stream schedule too and get some fast drafts done. It's just going to be late night or early morning, and we'll see. About to finalize that. But so I did a bunch of slow drafts. I really liked it. They got better as it went on, the weeks went on. The ones that started up about 2 weeks ago, at the beginning, I think I had some trouble there kind of getting the right run backs on certain teams, but I really like how a lot of my teams ended up, and I was going to share my exposure. It just finished loading the exposure, and I was going to share that with you all. I think I'm going to organize it a little bit and share my exposure data and kind of how my drafts went, and I'm going to summarize that and put it together and share some of my Superflex draft results and research probably in the next week. I'm probably going to put that together this weekend after day 1 of the draft. I'll have some downtime, and I'll probably be working on some of that Superflex data. So look forward to that. More content coming out soon, but we're here live. And today I'm getting into the rookie running back production profiles. It's some good stuff. There's just, a really deep running back class. I've really enjoyed researching this running back class. And so here we go. Who's that running back? It's Zach Charbonnet. Zach Charbonnet produced 168 yards per game in 2022. I feel like this doesn't get talked up enough. I get that he's in the Pac-12, but when he's putting up 136 rushing yards per game out of his team's 240 total rushing yards, he's representing 57% of his team's rushing yards per game. That's monstrous workload. Okay, and so what I'm looking at here, I've got my charts. You can see we're looking at each player's rushing yards per game stacked with their receiving yards per game on average over 2022, their last college season, and then totaled Here, 168 total yards. And then a completely different scale, right? But we're comparing his team's rushing yards per game, receiving yards per game, total yards per game. So for UCLA last year, they were averaging 240 rushing yards per game, 266 receiving yards per game for a massive 506 total yards per game. Incredible. And one other thing we can look at. So right now we're looking at over here, Zach Charbonnet. We're going to be comparing his stats in 2022, his attempts per game at 19.5 rushing attempts per game. He's got the green light there. He's got the green in his box. We're comparing him to the benchmark target of 15 rushes per game. That is the scout, in my mind, and from research I've done, when scouts are looking at a running back and determining if he can handle an NFL workload, they look for 15 rushing attempts per game, at least minimum, and 1.5 receptions per game. And Charbonnet has the green light in both of these areas. He's got 3.7 receptions per game. Incredible. So he's got over 23 touches per game out of his team's 61 either rushes or passing plays. So he's representing, well over a third of his team's touches per game. He's very productive. He's PFF category bell cow running back. All right. And I think we can see clearly why here. Another thing I wanted to point out, this table up here, this is 2022 FBS team data by percentile. And so by team percentile, we can look at the 90th percentile is 214 rushing yards per game. When we know that UCLA had 240 rushing yards per game, this star indicates UCLA was well above the 90th percentile for rushing yards per game as a team, where their attempts per game as a team were only just above the 70th percentile. To me, that indicates this was a highly, highly efficient rushing offense. They could generate more rushing yards per attempt than would be expected looking across the entire league. And if you can attribute that to their primary ball carrier, which 57% of the time was Zach Charbonnet, I think we've settled our case. We've got a bell cow rookie running back, Zach Charbonnet. Could he go in the first round? I don't think so. I think he goes probably in the second round, but I'm not a draft expert, and based on his production profile, I really like this guy. I want to draft him in fantasy football in all formats. Zach Charbonnet looks like a great prospect here. Okay, let's move on. I think that's all I wanted to say about this, but there's a lot of good data here, and we're going to move on to the next rookie. So let's go ahead and do that. Who's that running back? It's Kenny McIntosh. Kenny McIntosh, running back for the Georgia Bulldogs, last year produced 89 yards per game total, split between 55 rushing yards per game and 34 receiving yards per game over the 15 games he played, of course. When you compare this to his team's production, the team totaled 207 and 296 rushing and receiving yards per game, respectively, for a whopping 503 total yards per game. We all know that Georgia team was humming on offense. So that's what we're looking at here. We've got Kenny McIntosh, clear receiving game, right? He's got 34 out of his 89 yards per game coming from his reception work. And that's why PFF has him categorized as a running back by committee space back. Kenny McIntosh, compared to our benchmarks for scouting, if we're looking at college production compared to, if we project that into the NFL and if we think they can handle an NFL workload, our benchmarks are, again, 15 rushing attempts per game. Kenny McIntosh was splitting the workload. He was a committee back in Georgia. We can clearly see he was splitting his attempts, his yards per game with Edwards, with his other backs in the rotation at Georgia. So he didn't really get above that 15 carries per game threshold. And hey, what's up, peanut butter and waivers? What's going on? And so we're going through our rookie production profiles, college production profiles. Kenny McIntosh, right? Where he excels, it's the receptions per game. 2.9 receptions per game. Look at his team's receptions. He's making up 13% of his team's target share. I mean, that's incredible for a running back. And he clearly exceeds the benchmark 1.5 receptions per game with his productions last year. When you total him up, he actually gets to about 13 touches per game, which is pretty good. It's not quite at that 16.5 we'd want for a workhorse like a bell cow running back. Like we said, he's a space back. We look at what Georgia was doing last year. It's actually pretty interesting. Their attempts per game, they're at they're at 36 attempts per game, which was below the 50th percentile across the FBS last year, but their rushing yards per game was super efficient, right? So at 207 rushing yards per game over here, that's well above the 80th percentile for rushing yards. Overall, I think Kenny McIntosh has a chance to be a committee back and have fantasy impact pretty quickly. I've seen him, his receiving work is elite, and I think that's going to give him fantasy relevancy and NFL relevancy. Let's move on to the next rookie. Who's that running back? It's Syracuse running back Sean Tucker. Wow, this guy is really polarizing. I don't know what to say about Sean Tucker, but let's just look at his production. And he actually had some incredible production, except when you look at his team totals. Syracuse as a total, we're only putting up 375 yards of total offense last year. That's not very good. Let's think about the context of it, though. Well, they've got 144 team rushing yards, and Sean Tucker was making up 62% of the rushing yards per game. That seems like he was literally doing it all. He put the team on his back. That's way higher than you would expect. We're getting some Sean Tucker love in the chat. You know, I'm starting to warm up to Sean Tucker, and the more I hear about him, the more I've seen, I think that he deserves consideration in the draft to be one of these, what it says, PFF category, running back by committee power backs. I mean, his production profile says he could be a workhorse. Let's look at what he's got going on the left side here in his own stats compared to the team in the benchmark. Attempts per game, 17. He's killing it there. You know, receptions per game, 3. He's dominating receptions, except when I looked at his 21 receiving yards per game and throw that up to, you know, he's getting 3 receptions per game. It's like 7 yards receiving per game. It's not terrible, but, you know, maybe he doesn't have the best cast around him in college to support him, and I wonder if that's coming out because he's got a lot of production metrics, but his team's efficiency and attempts and yards are all super low, and so all of the productivity that was happening at Syracuse, it's like Sean Tucker is responsible for all of it, right? He's 51% of their attempts per game. He's 17% of their reception share. He's 40% of their total touches per game, and he's getting 35% of their touchdowns. Sean Tucker was Syracuse. The fans love him, so we'll see where he gets drafted. I'm hopeful for Sean Tucker. I think that the NFL teams might have some hangups on him without his testing and what's been going on. I will say in our ADP trends for the rookie class, the series I had done in the last month, Sean Tucker was the biggest faller of all the running backs, and he was just really going down boards all summer long. We'll see what happens with that one. Next up, who's that running back? It's Pitt Israel Abanikanda. Oh man, this profile is something else. It looks really good. 130 rushing yards per game, but wait, 13 receiving yards per game. That's really interesting. Not a lot of receiving work, clearly, but the total yards per game is outstanding. Pitt put up about 410 total yards per game last year, and Izzy was responsible for 35% of that yards per game production at 143 yards per game. Pretty impressive stuff. He's PFF category running back by committee space back. If we look over at his individual stats, attempts per game, almost 22. Green light there, well eclipsing the 15 carry benchmark. And he's representing 56% of his team's rushing attempts per game. For receptions, Izzy had 1.1 receptions per game in college. It's a little bit below the 1.5 benchmark we'd want to see. And so hesitant to say that he can full bell cow back workload that we're looking for in fantasy. I think he can still be really productive, and he can still attribute a lot to wherever he lands up. And he's going to get good draft capital. The way that he tested, his speed, his size, his age, all of these factors that, people are giving them the green light on. But, just look at his production. 70% of their rushing production. That's insane. We look at him. He's the Pitt's team was just above or just at the 70th percentile for attempts per game, and their rushing yards per game was also at the 70th percentile, so that's pretty much in line. Overall, Izzy, I think his landing spot's going to matter a ton, how early he goes in the draft. But for fantasy, for the NFL, I don't think it matters, what round he's going to go in. People are really on board with Izzy. I'm on board with Izzy. I want him on my teams too. That receptions per game and receiving yards per game, I think there's an opportunity for that to come up, but it's a little bit concerning. Let's move on to the next rookie. Who's that running back? It's TCU's Kendre Miller. Kendre Miller averaged 100 rushing yards per game last year in college, but only 8 receiving yards per game. He made up 24% of the yards per game production of TCU's offense last year. Honestly, that's a little bit lower than I would expect for how much he was an impact on their offense. His rushing production was 51% of the team's yards per game last year, and that is what I was expecting. It's a huge number. So really, look how lopsided his receiving work is. And if we go to our scoreboard over here, we're looking at his benchmark, 16 attempts per game. Compare that to 15. The benchmark, he gets the green light. Receptions per game, 1.1, just like Izzy Abanikanda, another rookie we've talked about. A little bit low. Compared to his team, he's only representing 6% of the total receptions per game, but he's getting 31% of the touches, right? So he's representing more of the touches, a little bit less overall of the yardage per game. You would expect that because he's handling the rushing work. He's not getting the higher yards per reception work to increase his average, right? But PFF category bell cow back, interesting to me. I understand him handling 51% of the workload on the rushing side, coming out to 16 carries per game. And actually it was higher than that because I want to say this is including his last game when he was injured. And so it's a little bit higher. I remember I did some research excluding the injury game, and Kendre's stats were a little bit better, but still the receptions per game is concerning to me. When we compared TCU at 457 total yards per game, their 50th percentile on attempts at 37, but like we said, their rushing yardage at 196 was just below the 80th percentile for rushing yards per game. Kendre Miller, I've been really high on Kendre Miller. I'm still high on Kendre Miller. I want Kendre Miller on my teams. I think he's going to be good in fantasy. His production profile is throwing me off a little bit. There's more to understand there. Let's move on to the next rookie. Who's that running back? It's Tulane's Tyjae Spears, coming in with a massive 131 total yards per game. I love it. Representing 30% of Tulane's total yards per game last year in college. He handled 16.4 rushing attempts per game, getting the green light compared to our 15 rushing attempts per game benchmark. He also had 1.6 receptions per game on average. Not talked enough up is Tyjae Spears' work in the passing game. He can get those receptions. And, honestly, his output at a 9% share of the receptions is pretty good. Definitely can handle a workload, although we've got PFF category running back by committee space back. The touches per game at almost 18 compared to our benchmark at 16.5. I feel pretty good about saying, I feel good about saying that Tyjae Spears could be, I don't know if he could be an every down back, but I get the feeling that he can be like a RB1 in fantasy. That's what I'm trying to say. I had a hard time coming out with it, but Tulane was super efficient because of him last year. He had the big game in the Rose Bowl, and he got a lot of attention from that. He tested well. Everything's going well for him. I've heard of some injury concerns in the past. We'll look past that and see, all things equal, healthy. He's a really interesting running back prospect. His team, they were just above or just at the 70th percentile for attempts per game, but based on their 206 rushing yards per game, they were somewhere between the 90th and the 80th percentile for rushing yards per game. And 55% of that rushing yard per game production came from Tyjae Spears. He's very productive. I think he's going to do great in the NFL. Want him on my fantasy teams. Let's move on to the next rookie. Who's that running back? It's OU's Eric Gray, a running back who, coming into this summer after the 2022 college season, he's actually fallen a lot off apparently NFL draft boards. He's fallen down, and definitely for fantasy, not talked up enough. But let's look at his college production. Super productive, 133 total yards per game, representing only 28% of OU's total yards per game on offense last year. That's somewhat surprising to me. I guess if we look at his receiving work, he's only representing about 7% of the receiving yards per game. But wait a second, 2.8 receptions per game? How is no one talking up Eric Gray? I mean, I understand there were some testing concerns at the combine, and his ADP didn't do as many ADP favors. He was falling since the combine. It didn't do any favors the way he tested. But production speaks for itself. There's a ton of running backs who have been productive and had success in the NFL who didn't have the best speed or testing numbers at the combine. And so I'm willing to look past that and look at the upside here. Let's talk more about Eric Gray. 51% of OU's rushing. That's pretty impressive. OU is known for their running back rotation over the years, over the decades, I'm saying. And I understand they had a tough year last year, but 51% of the production, really impressive. The receiving work, he's working in there. He's getting the receptions and the yardage isn't there. That's interesting. Might speak somewhat to his ability. But PFF category bell cow, of course. This guy, he's a bell cow back. I mean, look what OU's offense was doing in terms of the rushing offense. Attempts per game, they're way up there. So there's a bunch of other guys who are getting the work as well. He was splitting the work in this backfield in OU, but their team's 222 rushing yards per game ranks in the 90th percentile across all FBS teams last year, and a ton of that, 40% of those attempts, 51% of that rushing yards production's coming from Eric Gray. He had 18 attempts per game, almost 3 receptions per game, almost 21 touches per game. Eric Gray, he's my sleeper pick. I'm going to be drafting him, in the later rounds of my dynasty drafts. I don't know if I'll be able to take him in any of these 18-round best ball tournaments, but I might have to. I might have to slip in an Eric Gray on one of my stronger, more robust RB starting teams. Chase Brown has been a guy that I had talked about in that best ball kind of late round range, someone you want to slide in. I talked about Kendre Miller in that spot a little bit earlier. He did rise as the summer went on. And, Eric Gray, not a guy I've been drafting thus far, but this production, I'm really intrigued by it. Still more to learn in the next few days, and as these players get drafted, there's a ton that will come out. We'll see how they fit with their new teams. Very exciting stuff. Let's move on to the next rookie. Who's that running back? It's University of Alabama, Birmingham, DeWayne McBride. And I knew this profile as soon as I saw it because of the 1 receiving yards per game. It's incredible. Actually, less than that. 33% of their total production, their yards per game, and 44% of their total touches per game. When you factor in he's only doing, he's only catching the ball like once a season. 49% of their attempts per game. DeWayne McBride was UAB offense last year, just as much as Sean Tucker was Syracuse offense last year. And I think they're comparable players and from a production standpoint in that regard. Obviously, Sean Tucker's catching a lot more balls. Let's look at UAB as a team. They were 80th percentile in their attempts per game. They were 90th percentile in their rushing yards per game. So DeWayne McBride, he's a very efficient runner. We see he's getting a huge workload. He's at almost 20 attempts per game in college last year. I think there's a role for him in the NFL. I think DeWayne McBride's going to find his way on a team. I've heard him compared to some other players. I'm not really sure where he's going to fit in. I've heard Gus Edwards. That's interesting. But for fantasy, not a guy I'm drafting a whole lot of. Let's move on to the next rookie. Who's that running back? It's Ole Miss Quinshon Judkins. Oh, wait a second. I forgot. Because Zach Evans was not the primary running back in his backfield last year. It was Quinshon Judkins, true freshman. He came in, put up a whopping 121 rushing yards per game, 10 receiving yards per game. When you break it down by the fact that he had more than reception per game, it's actually pretty impressive. As a true freshman, having a 6% reception share, a 45% share of the attempts, and a 47% share of the rushing yards per game. This dude, we're going to be looking out for him over the next few years. Quinshon Judkins. But let's move on to Zach Evans. Who's that running back? Oh, I went the wrong way. Let's try that again. Who's that running back? It's not Quinshon Judkins. It's Zach Evans. Zach Evans averaging a respectable 78 rushing yards per game, making up 30% of his team's rushing yards per game. Quinshon Judkins getting the 47%. That's a lot. But Zach Evans actually had a fair amount of receiving work, just enough. 1 reception per game, and representing 18% of his team's yardage per game. It's not the most inspiring numbers right there for Zach Evans. This player has gotten a lot of hype because he was highly scouted, playing at TCU, transferring to Ole Miss. Quinshon Judkins comes and totally eclipses his production, and so Zach Evans, looking kind of rough. At least you can say he's efficient. This is a very efficient offense. They're 90th percentile in attempts per game, but also above 90th percentile in rushing yards per game. Zach Evans was 26% of their attempts, 30% of their yards on a per game, so that's good. 20% of this offense. He's a PFF category running back by committee space back. I think he's more of a flyer in fantasy and a lot of upside, but not a guy I'm willing to kind of stake it on. Zach Evans. Let's move on to the next rookie. Who's that running back? It's A&M's Devon Achane. Achane, man, super productive. PFF category of a scat back, but he looks more like a bell cow to me. I understand there's the size limitations, but let's look at his production profile. He's handling 77% of A&M's rushing workload per game in terms of yardage, 65% in terms of attempts per game. He's getting almost 20 rushing attempts per game, well above our 15 attempt per game benchmark. Green light. 3.6 receptions per game, well above our 1.5 reception per game benchmark. Green light there. 23 touches per game. Devon Achane, I'm seeing the upside here. His production's outstanding. I get it. His team, 362 total yards per game, 142 rushing, pretty pathetic in the context, of the SEC. I get it. Tough defenses. 219 passing yards. That's where it really hurts. A&M was struggling in their passing game last year. They, as a team, were below 50th percentile in attempts per game. They were below 50th percentile in rushing yards per game. So, the only bright spot on this team seems to have been Achane last year. I'm really intrigued by him. Definitely a guy I'm drafting for best ball, for dynasty. I think even redraft he's going to have some appeal. We'll see, though. We'll see what kind of workload he can handle. According to everyone else, he can't handle a great workload. According to his own production in college, he can handle 23 touches per game. I'm high on Achane. I didn't want to be. He is an Aggie, but we won't use our bias against him and draft Achane. Let's move on to the next rookie. Who's that running back? It's Auburn's Tank Bigsby. Bigsby coming in with 39% of the rushing yards per game and 81 rushing yards per game. He's getting some receiving work. He's coming out with 9% of their yards per game in terms of receiving, but 19% of their reception share. So he's averaging 2.5 receptions per game. So Tank Bigsby actually, he's really productive in the passing and the ground game. He's efficient. He's putting out 100 total yards per game almost. 25% of his team's yardage production last year. It's impressive. I heard a lot about how bad Auburn was. Okay, and so maybe that plays into why Tank's numbers are a little bit lower on the whole. And it's interesting because it seems like he was in a committee himself in his own backfield. You look at Auburn having 80th percentile attempts per game while having above 80th percentile rushing yards per game at 208. And Tank Bigsby was only getting 37% of those attempts per game, coming out to just at 15 attempts per game. I didn't give him the green light because I have to round up, and he's right on that line. He did handle more attempts earlier as a true freshman. So I think we give it to him. He's a bell cow. He's got the green light for me. 2.5 receptions per game is pretty impressive. 17.4 total touches per game in college. Super productive. He's a guy I want to draft in all formats. Tank Bigsby, excited to see where he goes. Let's move on to the next rookie. Who's that running back? It's Texas Bijan Robinson. Shout out to Bijan Mustardson. If you haven't tried it, order yourself some. Highly recommend. Some good stuff. One of my favorite spreads. And our bias is gone. We're back. Bijan Robinson. Let's try that again. Talking about mustard. I'm probably just hungry right now. It's late, and I want a late night snack. We're just talking about Tank Bigsby. Let's talk about the next rookie running back. Who's that running back? It's Bijan Robinson, delivering 158 total yards per game, 26 receiving yards per game on over 1.6 receptions on average, over 21 rushing attempts per game, making up 60% of his team's rushing attempts, 70% of his team's rushing yards, and 37% of his team's total yardage per game. Incredible. He's a running back. He's a receiver. He's a PFF category bell cow. Bijan Robinson. Bijan Robinson. If you're lucky enough to draft him on your dynasty team, get him. Redraft, everyone's going to sprinkle him in. Underdog, best ball tournament games this summer, definitely going to sprinkle him in. I've got some exposure to Bijan on my underdog teams. I'm really excited about it. Let's talk more about Bijan's college production. Texas came in at below 50th percentile team attempts per game, but they were above the 70th percentile in team rushing yards per game with 189 total team rushing yards per game. 70% of those, 132 yards per game, came from Bijan Robinson. So they're super efficient. Although they're attempting well below the average rushing attempts per game at less than 36, super efficient and producing above the 70th percentile for rushing yards per game. Bijan is, by far the best production profile that I've looked at from this class across all of the positions, and really excited to see what he can do in the NFL. So let's move on to the next rookie. Shout out to HEB sparkling water. Excuse me. The next rookie. Who's that running back? It's Roschon Johnson. Well, this production profile looks quite a bit different than the others. He's only producing 46 rushing yards per game and 11 reception yards per game for a total of 57. Out of Texas's total 430 yards per game, he's only representing 13% of their total yards per game, although he did come in with actually 13% of their total touchdowns per game. And I was going to say 16% of their total touches per game, 16% of the touches, 13% of the yardage. That's because he wasn't getting a lot of the receiving work. A lot of the receiving work was going to Bijan Robinson, of course. And so when Roschon Johnson is getting the work, he doesn't get the opportunities that you would expect. PFF category, running back by committee power back. Yeah, I would agree to that. We just talked a lot about Bijan Robinson. Here's a little bit about Roschon, throwing him in. We talked about a lot of rookies, and let's see, do we have one more left? We don't. That's all of the rookies. I'm getting pretty tired. It's a late night stream, super late night here. That's a funny picture. It's a picture in a picture. Thanks for watching the stream. This was live. If you're watching this on the recorded version, thank you so much. Please like, share, subscribe. Follow me on Twitter at FFB Garage, Fantasy Football Garage. I'm going to be sharing this data on my Twitter. I'll be posting it out in a series of images, text to follow, good stuff. I'll be chopping up this live video. I'm going to be saving it and working with it, editing it, maybe posting it as a condensed video, 5-minute version or so later this week when I'm in Tampa. And then I'll also be posting shorts. I think I'm going to have some scheduled to send out tomorrow if I can get it done. And the next day, thanks to my viewers for watching. It's been a lot of fun putting together these production profiles. I wanted to do more. Timing just ran out. We probably will put some more together now that we have all this formatting done. It's pretty easy to rattle these off now. So we'll wait and see who else gets drafted. Throw a couple of these together for the remaining running backs we haven't done yet. And then, hey, maybe we look at some receiving data. One last note I wanted to share out there, if you're still listening, by the way. Exciting stuff with Best Ball. A lot of that data, I'm going to be putting together some research, some Best Ball research. There's a lot of different series I've got that I want to put together, and I'm going to be using my streaming and content schedule for the month of May to accomplish a few of those things, and more on that to come. So thanks for watching. I'm ending the stream. It's super late, and it's been fun. We've been talking rookie running back production profiles, just sharing my research, and share your thoughts, comments below. As always, this is a Fantasy Football Garage. I'm Chris.